Good evening, everyone. I'm Lucas Held, Communications Director at the Wallace Foundation, and on behalf of the Museum of Public Relations and the Institute for Public Relations, let me welcome all of you to this evening's conversation, Does Truth Still Matter? Truth, Decay, and the Implications for the Practice of Public Relations. And before I begin, I'd like to just give a quick thank you to our sponsors, the Institute for Public Relations, the University of the Arts in London, Proof Analytics, Muckrack, the Edward L. Bernays Foundation, Ray Kocher, Gary Sheffer, Robert Baratoni, Gregory and Vine, and WeWork, and a special thanks to the indefatigable couple, Shelley and Barry Spector, and the Institute for Public Relations with its peripatetic CEO, Tina McCorkindale, who will also be on our panel. I'd like also to thank Michael Romali at the New York Philanthropy for his encouragement and support. And of course, let me thank our distinguished panelists who have flown thousands of miles to be here, and our speaker, keynote speaker, Jennifer Kavanaugh. And also thank you to the folks from a number of trade media who are here and covering this event. Now, whether you use the phrase public relations, public information, or strategic communication, those of us in the field of public relations have a special interest in the information environment that RAND's new study, Truth, Decay, describes. So on the one hand, it's the context in which we operate and therefore shapes our work. And we've had to adapt to it. We've become knowledgeable in areas ranging from search engine optimization to influence nodes on Twitter, from infographics with images and few words to podcasts with spoken words and no images. It's a new world for us. And yet, we're not only shaped by the information environment, we also help shape it as stewards of public communications for the organizations we represent. Many of us here shepherd the websites of our organizations. We draft speeches. We set broad policies on public communications, develop positions and messages, and we help manage the two-way street of public relations, representing an organization and the issues it cares about to the public, and ideally also bringing the public interest inside the organization. And because of this dual relationship, that is being both shaped and shapers, this study that Jennifer Kavanaugh, our keynote speaker, has co-authored is of prime interest to us, and we're going to try to tackle three questions. Does PR bear some responsibility for the current state of truth decay? Do we have a responsibility to help ameliorate the conditions that she'll describe? And how can we be effective in this new environment? And it's important to note that this conversation joins one that is, in a sense, already in progress. The Arthur W. Page Society has embraced an emphasis on corporate character as a way to ensure integrity. And I know Roger Bolton was planning to be with us tonight. Yes? Oh, Roger, please stand. Thank you. Yep, please stand up. Also, the Public Relations Society of America is expanding its code of ethics to respond to new digital technologies, building on the current plank of honesty. And I think the CEO, Joseph Troncalli, is here. And two other things. The Commission on Public Relations Education has one of its prime recommendations, the addition of a mandatory course on ethics. In fact, if you scan its 172-page report, there are 137 references to ethics. That's almost one on every page compared to 86 for social media. So that tells us something. Planck Center for Leadership and Public Relations has surveyed communications professionals and found that a big problem is that practitioners have low trust in an organization's ability to keep its promises. And many of us know of the Edelman Trust Survey and the Weber-Shandwick Survey on Civility. So if this is already going on, if this is a conversation already in progress in a sense, what do we hope to do here tonight? Well, our hope is to contribute to and deepen that discussion in two ways. First, we're going to use a broad lens linking PR and the civic concerns outlined by the RAND Corporation. And second, by grounding the discussion in this important new RAND study. And before introducing Jennifer, I'd be remiss if I didn't say a little bit about the RAND Corporation. Based in Santa Monica with offices in Pittsburgh and Virginia, RAND was born in the post-war era in 1948 after it broke away from Douglas Aircraft, where it started as Project RAND, which was short for Research and Development. And as historian James Allen Smith has written in his book, The Idea Brokers, RAND and think tank are virtually synonymous, the term having been adapted from wartime slang. And once on its own, as Smith recounts, it became, quote, the model for the new generation of think tanks. And by that, he meant that RAND distinguishes itself and continues to do so by pioneering what are now regarded as best practices for research organizations. An unyielding commitment to objectivity and nonpartisanship, rigorous quality control through internal and external peer review, and an emphasis on systems thinking. And one of the main contributions, in my mind, of this study is its conceptual framework, which Jennifer will share, that describes drivers, agents, trends, and consequences. And Jennifer is Associate Director of the Strategy, Doctrine, and Resources Program of the RAND Arroyo Center, which is the U.S. Army's sole federally funded research and development center for studies and analysis. Now, she's a modest person, but her talents were recognized early on as her doctorate was honored in 2011 with the Harold D. Laswell Award for being the best dissertation in the nation on public policy. And the juries called her thesis remarkably original, thorough, and persuasive analysis that breaks new ground. And they said it was very much in the spirit of the great Harold D. Laswell, the pioneering social scientist who drew heavily on thinking about public attitudes and perceptions. In other words, about communications. And her new study, Truth Decay, co-authored with RAND's president, Michael Rich, is marked by the same contribution, I think you'll find when you read it, of creativity, subtlety, objectivity, and careful analysis. So with that, will you please help me welcome, if I can get this slide operating, Jennifer Kavanaugh.
Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm really looking forward to talking about this project that we've been working on now and then with our panel afterwards. So truth decay is the term that RAND is using to describe the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis are playing in our political and civil discourse. And this general topic, the role that facts and data should and do play, has been a popular one over the past 18 months. But RAND's interest in this topic really began before this popularity. Our CEO, Michael Rich, my co-author, has been interested in this topic for at least a decade. And he became interested in initially as a threat to RAND. If RAND is a research institute charged with providing research and analysis to inform policymakers, and analysis and facts and data are no longer important, then that presents a challenge to RAND. But increasingly, as the problem has grown more severe, it's become clear that the more serious implications are the threat that it poses to our democratic institutions. And so Michael asked me to join him in researching this topic, taking a systematic look into what truth decay is, whether we've seen it before, and what we should be doing about it. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk first about the framework that we developed to think about it. I'm going to talk about this question of is it new, and I'm going to present our research agenda, how we're thinking about moving forward on this topic and what we've been doing since the end of the report. Now, we set out with a number of goals. Our first goal was to provide a common terminology, a framework to discuss this topic. And prior to our report, one of the challenges in this debate was that there was no common terminology. So people were using similar words to talk about different things, and different words to talk about the same things. And that made it really difficult to have a unified conversation about this topic. The second thing we wanted to do was to present a holistic framework. Rather than talking only about the role of the media or only about the role of political polarization, we wanted to understand how these different elements interact together to drive this larger systemic phenomenon that we were observing. And finally, we wanted to take this topic and this debate and take it outside of the partisan boundaries in which it had largely been contained, to have a more productive discussion about what we were observing and, more importantly, what we could do about it. So the framework that we developed to define and discuss truth decay depicts truth decay as a system. You have the trends in the center, which is how we defined it, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. We have the drivers and the agents that contribute to it, exacerbate it, and in fact cause it, and the consequences, the implications, and how it affects our democratic institutions. And what's important here is the interrelationships between these different elements that you see depicted by the arrows. And these feedback mechanisms mean that truth decay is really a self-driving and self-generating phenomenon, which increases its complexity and the challenge that we face to fight it. So first, definitions. We defined truth decay as comprising 4 specific trends. First, an increasing disagreement about facts and data. And so we're talking about 2 different kinds of disagreement here. The first is disagreement about objective facts that we can verify. And the second is disagreement about analytical interpretations of data and facts. And so examples would be the safety of GMOs or the safety of vaccines. Areas where we have an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence in support of the safety of vaccines, of GMOs, and yet an increasing number of people are skeptical of the safety, of their safety. And we see this in other areas as well. Data on crime, and a number of other areas where people are increasingly rejecting growing bodies of scientific evidence. The second trend is a blurring of the line between fact and opinion. And you can see this anytime you turn on cable news or look at social media, anywhere where fact, opinion, commentary, and falsehood are presented interchangeably in a way that's really difficult for an information consumer to determine what is a fact and what is not. Related to this, we have an increase in the relative volume of opinion compared to fact, and that increases the influence of this opinion. So if you think back maybe 20, 30 years, we had 2-3 hours of TV news a day. Now we have 24 hours of news a day. But we haven't really seen a commensurate increase in the amount of facts that are communicated in that news. So instead, all of this extra time has been filled with opinion and commentary and analysts expounding on their opinion or their interpretation. And so we've shifted from fact-based news to commentary or opinion-based news, and that's an important piece of this problem. And finally, declining trust in formally respected sources of factual information. And this would include government and the media. So what we end up with is a situation where individuals are not only struggle to determine what is a fact and what is not, but they also aren't even really sure where to look to find that factual information to make a determination about what is fact and what is not. So with that definition in mind, we set out to answer the question, is this new? And this is an important question for a couple of reasons. If truth decay is new, if we've never seen it before, that suggests one approach to this problem or one set of responses. If it's something that we have seen before in its entirety or in pieces, that suggests another approach to this challenge. So what we did was we did a broad survey of US history since the Civil War to identify other periods that seemed like they had some of the hallmarks, some of these 4 specific trends that I just mentioned. And we identified 3 other periods that we thought were worth looking into further. The first were the 1880s to 1890s, so the Gilded Age, which was a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization, the time when we saw the rise of mass newspapers. The 1920s to the 1930s were the Great Depression and the lead up to World War II. And during this period, we saw not only tabloid journalism, which was similar to yellow journalism in the sense that it provided sensationalized stories of sex and violence, as well as the rise of radio. And finally, the 1960s to 1970s. So this was the Vietnam era leading up to Watergate. And what we found was significant evidence of those 2 middle trends, a blurring of the line between fact and opinion, and an increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact. We saw this across all 3 periods. So in the 1880s to 1890s, we see it in the form of yellow journalism, exceptional, sensationalized stories printed in order to sell more newspapers. In the 20s and 30s, the best example is the rise of radio. And radio in the 1930s functioned in many of the ways that cable news does today, with powerful radio hosts who use their platform to spread their opinions to a wide mass audience. And in the 60s and 70s, we saw the spread of television as the primary form through which information was disseminated. And while this provided people with a lot more information and a more direct access to information, it also, in some of the same ways that we see social media and the internet today, provided new tools and ways to spread disinformation. We also see some evidence of the final trend, declining trust in institutions that provide factual information. In the 20s and 30s, there were, for obvious reasons, increasing distrust in banks and the government for their failure to address the Great Depression and the challenges that came with it. In the 60s and 70s, we see trends very similar to today in terms of declining trust in the media and the government. But a big difference between the 60s and 70s and today in the area of trust is the absolute level of trust at which we are at. In the 60s and 70s, we saw a significant decline, but we were substantially higher in absolute terms in terms of the percentage of people who expressed trust in these institutions. But what we don't see in these other periods is that first trend, this increasing disagreement over objective facts and data. Of course, there were skeptics. There's always been disagreements about opinion, people who have challenged authority. That's common. But what we have today is something that's unique in the sense that we have a divergence between the amount of data and information that we have that allows us to verify and understand scientific findings, and the increasing skepticism or rejection of that data within our society. And so that's different and new, and that's important. And I'll talk a little bit later about why we think we see this difference. The good news is that these previous periods of truth decay did end. And so we're looking into why they ended, and we don't have a complete answer yet, but we have a few observations. The first is the role that investigative journalism plays in helping to get facts out there and restore confidence and an understanding of why facts is important. And some of that comes from the bottom up, people demanding facts, and some of it comes from the top down, journalists actively pursuing facts and making that an important part of their job and agenda. And the second is increasing transparency and accountability, and we see that in the government and we see it in media. As one example, the 1930s was when the government first started using data as a really important input into policy-making process, things like GDP and unemployment and inflation. Those were things that economists then began to track to make better economic policies, in part as a reaction to an understanding of what happens when we make policy decisions without data informing them. So what can we do to trigger these same kinds of changes today? In order to understand that, we need to talk a little bit more about the rest of the framework. So I want to go back now and talk a little bit about what's causing this phenomenon. We identified 4 drivers of truth decay. The first is something that's not new, cognitive processing, the way we process information. There have always been characteristics of human information processing that have made us more likely to reject facts that don't agree with our pre-existing opinions. And in addition to this confirmation bias, we also use heuristics, shortcuts to make decisions when we're confronted with lots of information. And we rely on our friends and family and our social networks heavily for information, even when that information that we get from them diverges from the facts and data that we might see elsewhere. And we're heavily influenced by emotional experiences in a way that we aren't influenced by data and analysis. And the reason this is important is that it allows disinformation to spread and become embedded. Once we believe something, it's really difficult to dislodge that belief, even if it's incorrect, even when presented with contradictory information. The second driver is perhaps the most important, and this is changes in the information system. And we've seen a number of changes, and so this would include changes in the speed and volume of information that we have access to with social media and the internet, and the tools that those developments provide to people and actors who want to spread disinformation. It also includes increased access. Democratized access to information is a good thing, but it also creates a challenge for quality. How do we ensure the quality of that information when anybody has access to becoming a source? It includes changes in the economics of the media market, the shrinking profit margins and the increasing number of media outlets, which place pressure on media companies' bottom line and encourage them to make cuts. Investigative journalism is expensive. Hiring a bunch of experts to talk about their opinions or write an op-ed is much cheaper. And so there's an economic incentive for the shift towards commentary-based news. And finally, the role that filters and algorithms play in skewing and shaping the information that we see when we do seek out information. Each of us would probably get different results when Googling the same term based on our past search history. And I'm sure we've all had experiences of Googling something and then being followed for months by ads for that thing. And that's relatively innocuous if it's flights to Australia or gyms near my house. But it's much more dangerous if it's something that's promoting disinformation and actively pushing people towards sites that proliferate or disseminate that type of information. The third driver are competing demands on the education system, along with the increasingly stringent fiscal constraints, which challenge the ability of schools to provide students with the skills they need to navigate this really complex information environment. Technology changes quickly, and we've seen rapid changes in our information system. But the changes in our institutions have happened much more slowly. And so schools haven't been able to keep up. They haven't been able to yet integrate the types of classes and modules and other types of activities that can help improve students' ability to evaluate information, to determine what's a good source and what's a bad source, to form complex opinions by synthesizing information from many different sources. These are things that students increasingly struggle with. If you look at the data on how students spend their time, how teachers allocate the time during the day, we see a decline in just the types of education that we would hope students are getting to navigate this information. And that includes things like civics education, statistics to understand how to read a poll. It includes certain types of science education, often fact-based science education, or training in scientific method to conduct that kind of scientific reasoning. These are the types of training of courses that we see taking up a shrinking amount of time during the school day, and yet they're the skills that we think students probably need, and research suggests they do need, to become critical thinkers. Of course, this isn't just a problem for students, it's a problem for adults. Anybody who went to school before, say, 95, probably never even had experience with the internet when they were in school, and so they, again, do not have these skills to navigate this environment. So this creates a susceptible population that really allows truth decay to thrive. And finally, polarization. And here I'm not just talking about political polarization, but also economic and social polarization, and the extent to which these different types of polarization are increasingly occur along the same lines. And what that means is we have a fragmented society. We go to school, we work, we do activities, we go to religious services with this people who share a very similar economic background to us, a very similar set of beliefs and attitudes and values as us. And to the extent that partisanship then collapses these different types of identities, it creates a very final divide that allows these alternative and competing narratives to really thrive and proliferate. Now, there are certain aspects of truth decay that are autonomous in the sense that they act on their own. Cognitive processing, these biases have always existed. Social media, for all its ills, was not invented to cause this problem. But there are other actors within this system who exacerbate and make truth decay worse, who amplify these trends. And they do this both intentionally and unintentionally. And so I want to talk about a few of them. The first are media organizations. There are plenty of media organizations that are committed to providing fact-based information. Of course, even they can make mistakes. The rush, the pressure to be the first to a story can lead to false information being included. And even when a retraction is printed, as I said before, it's really difficult to change people's minds, to get them to update their beliefs. And there are other actors within the media ecosystem that are not as committed to facts and data. They may be driven by other agendas, economic agendas or partisan agendas. Research and academic institutions are kind of in the same category. They contribute both intentionally and unintentionally, despite there being many actors who are acting honestly and working towards facts. We rely on research organizations and academia to help us build knowledge, to move knowledge forward. But even researchers can make mistakes, and researchers and academic institutions can contribute to this problem when bias influences research, either because of a funding stream or because the researcher has incentives to play with their data in order to get their paper published, for which we know there are incentives within that academic market. The same thing can happen. We have evidence that there are some researchers who act with actual malfeasance in terms of creating or making up their own data for the same purpose. The third set of actors I want to talk about are political actors and the lobbyists that influence them. Now, we know that politicians spin the truth. That's not new. That's something that we've known for a long time. But increasingly, lobbyists are playing a really important role in this phenomenon. Dan Dresner has a good book called The Ideas Industry that provides some really great data on the rapid increase in the number of single-issue research organizations that have a very small number of funders with a very specific agenda. And the proliferation of these institutions, the cherry-picking of facts and manipulation of information to present a specific story, and to be clear, this happens across the political spectrum and across issues, that produces both misleading information that pollutes the information environment and also erodes trust in these same actors that we were talking about before. We know that foreign actors also play a role. There's been plenty of attention to the role that Russia played in spreading disinformation to exacerbate some of the tensions within the American electorate. And we know that China and other international actors are doing the same thing. And finally, corporations. And corporations can contribute, again, intentionally and unintentionally in three ways. The first is they can provide actual false information, either by mistake or on purpose. The second is they can provide misleading information, much as the same way as lobbyists, cherry-picking facts in order to present a specific agenda. And the final is by withholding information, by not providing the full set of information, by not being transparent in a way that is basically akin to providing false information, because they aren't giving full information either about what they know or what kinds of data they have on their customers or their users. So now shifting to consequences. When we talked about the consequences of truth decay, we really wanted to focus in on the consequences for our democratic institutions and the consequences at the individual level to the extent that we could get there. Now, a number of things happen when we have competing sets of facts. The first is we see an erosion in civil discourse. Democracy is founded on our ability to have meaningful discussions even when we disagree. Even if we don't ever come to an agreement, those discussions are helpful in helping us to think through issues and grapple with our values. Increasingly, we see a decline or an erosion in these types of discussions. Again, I'm sure we've all had experiences of trying to talk to someone who has a different viewpoint than we do. And oftentimes those conversations, instead of proceeding with both parties having an open mind to discuss the issues on the table and leaving as friends, maybe each having gained a new perspective, that doesn't really happen. Instead, it disintegrates into arguing and fighting and alienation in a lot of cases. And that has implications for our democracy. Of course, this erosion of civil discourse affects our political institutions as well. When our policymakers don't share a common set of facts, it's increasingly difficult for them to have meaningful policy discussions about policy options. Instead of debating the pros and cons, weighing the various values and priorities, they spend all their time talking about what are the facts at the table. The immigration debate is a great example of a case where there is data that could be brought to the discussion. Increasingly, that data is pushed aside to having a debate about overwhelming, that's driven by emotion instead. We see economic implications from this political polarization. When we have the government shutdown that happened in 2013, the estimated economic cost to the American economy was on the order of $15 to $20 billion. And that's a low estimate because it does not include the costs of contractors who couldn't work. And you can imagine there's lots of stuff that we could have done with that $15 to $20 billion instead of waste it. Similarly, when we have delays in in the appointment and approval of judges, this creates delays in the court system, which cost our economy, according to RAND estimates, over $3 billion a year. That's, again, a huge annual cost that we're paying because of this the toxic political environment. Third, alienation and disengagement. Individuals in an environment infected by truth decay appear to disengage. We see decline in voter participation, really across demographic groups. People who just sort of check out. They don't understand, they can't decide what's a fact, they don't trust any of the institutions, and so they choose not to participate. But democracy is founded on people participating and people taking an active role in their government. And if we lose that, it's not clear that we can continue to have a healthy democracy. And finally, uncertainty. Uncertainty exists at many levels. Policymakers struggle to make decisions when they don't have objective benchmarks to inform their decisions. And similarly, individuals struggle to make decisions about things like how to invest their money, whether or not to buy health care. If they don't have good data, they can't make an accurate assessment about whether or not that's going to be in their long-term interest or not. And it affects corporations too. We know that during election years, corporations defer investments because they don't know what the climate is going to be like in the next year. Now imagine if every year is like an election year in terms of uncertainty, and they keep deferring that investment. That has economic consequences. And it, of course, also has national security implications. If our allies and adversaries can't take US statements of intention as actual statements of intention, or they're unsure whether this is disinformation or true information, they may make decisions that are counter to our national security interests. So truth decay is a complex problem. It's a real challenge. But there's a lot that we still don't know. This is probably the most striking finding that we took away from this report, was that although we have a good sense of what the problem is, there's still lots of gaps in this knowledge. And until we have a really good understanding of the contours of the problem, it's difficult to think about how we should be crafting solutions for that problem. And so in our final chapter of our report, we lay out this research agenda that has 4 specific streams, areas where we think more research is needed. The first are historical and international analogs. We need to know more about what's happened in the past and what's happening elsewhere, so we can take away lessons, things that we could apply to our current situation to help us move things forward, to make things better. Second, we need to do more data collection and looking at trends. We don't have a good sense of how much disinformation exists now, or how much disinformation existed 20 or 30 years ago. And so it's hard for us to say how bad of a problem is this, how different is this than before. We feel like it's worse, but maybe that's just because we have it constantly on our phone in our hand all the time. And so we need to be able to map the contours of this problem. We need to be able to measure social and demographic polarization in order to figure out where we should focus our attention and what levers we need to pull. We need to understand more about the truth decay as a system. We need to understand the mechanisms and the processes and interactions between all the different elements that I've talked about tonight. We need to understand not only how polarization contributes to truth decay, but how as truth decay gets worse, it also exacerbates polarization. And that kind of feedback is what we need to understand so that we can figure out ways to target critical points to disrupt that system and help work towards solutions. And finally, our final goal, which is to work towards responses and solutions. What can we do? It's not going to be one solution. There's not going to be a silver bullet. It's going to be many solutions in the near, the medium, and the long term. But what can we do actively as citizens, as policy organizations? What should we be telling policymakers? How should we be working with media organizations? So since we published our report in January, we've started a number of projects focused on different pieces of this problem that come out of our research agenda. We're looking at how media content has changed, using machine learning tools to understand things like how has the tone and sentiment of media changed? Has it become more hostile? Can we compare the tone and sentiment in cable news versus network news? Can we map this over time? We're also building a framework to understand possible options for improving the quality of information available. And this ranges anywhere from government regulation to things that users need to do to things that tech company needs to do. We're conducting surveys to get a better sense of why people do and do not trust institutions. We have good information on whether or not people trust institutions, but we have very little data on why they trust institutions. What are the characteristics of those institutions that drive public trust? Until we know the answer to that why question, it's hard to think about what we should be doing to rebuild trust in institutions. So we're collecting this data, we're analyzing it now. We've also collected data on the growing number of media literacy programs that are aimed at that education problem, this gap between the skills students need and the skills they have. And we're trying to develop an evaluative framework that will allow us to evaluate those programs, to figure out whether or not they're working. There are a lot of them. They're implemented in a growing number of schools, but we don't have good data on outcome measures. Are they actually helping students, and can we improve them? And we're expanding our historical analysis to dig more deeply into this question of what brought these periods to an end, and how can we extract those lessons? So truth decay is a really complex problem, and it's not going to get better unless we do something. Now, on the one hand, that's a pessimistic message, because this is a pretty serious problem, and it seems kind of, it's so complex it's hard to know where to start. On the other hand, I think it's an optimistic message, because having identified it and recognizing the role that we've played in it, both intentionally and unintentionally, gives us the opportunity to figure out how to address it and how to take advantage of all the new technology and tools that we have in a way that moves our democracy forward, that strengthens our institutions in a way that we might not have had we not had this challenge. So I will stop there, and I am looking forward to our panel.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that terrific presentation. And certainly, as you say, identification of the problem is a necessary prerequisite to moving toward any kind of solution. And to help us think about solutions, I'd like to call our panelists up. And we're going to see if we can unpack some of the implications for public relations. And then we will open it up to Q&A. And afterwards, please, everybody, stay for a reception where you can talk to Jennifer and our panelists. So let me call up Jim Campbell, who is a distinguished professor of political science at the University of Buffalo. SUNY? Yes, exactly. We have name tags on the seats. Also, Pat Ford, who's worldwide vice chair and senior advisor, Burson Cohn and Wolf. Tina McCorkindale, who is president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. Mark Stoos, who's CEO of Proof Analytics. And Norris West, who's director of strategic communications for the NEE Casey Foundation. And thank you all for being here. And I actually guess I don't have to stand back there, so I'll stand out here. Before we begin, Jennifer, just a quick question to you, which is, I think most of us are not used to thinking about truth decay as a national security problem, and you do a lot of work in national security. How do you think about the magnitude of this cluster of issues that you've identified for national security, for democracies? How serious an issue is this?
Well, I think it's a pretty serious issue. You know, the biggest challenge here is one of information. So international relations literature thinks about how asymmetries in information can lead to unintentional escalation and conflict. So when we have gaps in information, when we have disinformation, that really increases the risk for misunderstandings to expand into actual conflicts that can be anywhere from just a militarized dispute to something more serious. And so from the national security side, I think that's how we can think of it, this idea of messaging. There's also, of course, the chance that disinformation could actually trigger, if it's false, trigger bad decisions or incorrect decisions made based on bad information in a way that would, again, dramatically escalate the national security situation. In terms of the threat to democracy, I mean, it's a threat to our democracy, it's a threat to other democracies. Certainly this is a challenge that Europe is facing, and many other democracies are also facing the same challenge. There was many decades where the political scientists felt pretty good about democracy. It seemed like democracy was expanding everywhere, and they expected that trend to continue. I think it seems like democracy is under threat by disinformation. Certainly democracies are vulnerable to disinformation in a way that authoritarian governments aren't. And so I think there's those two threats. There's one, the threat of unintentional escalation, and second, the real challenge that this presents to democracy worldwide, not just in the United States, but as an international institution.
So a very big problem. I see a lot of heads nodding. So let's turn to Jim. And Jim, you're the author of a fascinating book called Polarized. It's actually, you can peruse a copy there. What surprised you about Jennifer's and Michael's study?
Well, let me say, I'm kind of fish out of water here, since a lot of you guys are PR people and political scientists who sort of new to this. I guess PR doesn't have a wall yet, so
you're very welcome in the precincts of PR.
I just had in reading your book, and first I say thank you for inviting me, and thank the institutions that are supporting this, and thank Jennifer for writing a terrific book, an interesting book on a very important topic. I had a set of points to make. Maybe since we want to keep this a little short, I thought I'd kind of stick to the script here. And but I also picked up a few things in your presentation this afternoon that I wanted to First, I think it's very important to understand the causes of truth decay in a broad sense, because I think truth or different views about what is true and what's not true have been around forever. I mean, it's common. I mean, I think some of us at a certain age remember the fluoride, controversy. So that's always been with us. And there are some factors that are just constants. There's different people have different experience. Just in the last week, Laurel Yanni, right? Laurel Yanni. What are you hearing? People have different experiences in the job market, in their sectors, parts of the country, their groups. Sometimes they have very different ideas about what is going on out there, and that's understandable. It's always there. Even the data is subject to, is not perfect on anything. One of the things I study is election forecasting, and we use economic data in that. And the economic data is constantly being revised. This is something that's hard. These are transactions. You think those numbers would be fairly stable at some point. Well, they're constantly being revised. And so we should, if the experts aren't sure about what the growth rate in the economy, whether it's high or low or awful, at one point it's kind of hard to expect individuals to be. So there's differences here. I think the biggest factor is this confirmation bias that you mentioned. People have predispositions, and there's a willingness to believe things that conform to those predispositions, and there's a willingness to be suspect or rejecting information that doesn't fit that. So those are constants. They've always been with us. They'll always be with us. Something else is happening, though, I think, that's changed this, so that there's a growing tendency or an increasing tendency to hold different views about reality. Why is that the case? I think there are two factors, and I think you touch on in different ways on these. I think it's almost a classic communications problem. That is, there's a problem with the senders, the information sources, and there's a problem with the receivers, the public or the elites making decisions based on that information, getting information. From the standpoint of the receivers, polarization, I think, is the big factor here. The fact that we're, as a nation, politically much more polarized than we had been for many years, has the effect of ratcheting up that confirmation bias. People feel even more strongly about resisting information that's not consistent with their views and welcoming information that is consistent. So it kind of amplifies that, and that's been accompanied by technology that in the media that certainly facilitate that. On the other side, we have the information sources, and I think this is something that there's maybe some contention at some level about. But information sources, scientists, educators, journalists, are widely perceived as having become more ideologically homogeneous, that there's an orthodoxy. Whether this perception is based on reality or not is really beside the point. Whatever caused it, beside the point. Whatever restraints of professionalism may blunt that effect is beside the point.
And
So
I'm
there's
actually
a perception of a
yeah.
dominant liberal orthodoxy
Yeah.
among us. And let me just give you three independent pieces of information about this, or a piece of evidence about this, about the truth about this. That is about the perception. One is a Pew study in 2017. 87% of Republicans said the media tends to favor one side. On the Democrats, only 53% said. over 35 points, about 35 points spread. 69, this in a Gallup Knight Foundation study, 2017. 69% of Republicans said the news media is doing a poor job in supporting our democracy today. 69%. Democrats, 17%. Over a 50-point gap. This is a chasm. And in Cato Institute commissioned a poll, again, 2017. Followed up on our president's remarks about our journalists, the enemy of the American people. Now, that's pretty harsh. They're the enemy of the American people. 63% of Republicans agreed with that. Only 11% of Democrats. Again, a 50%. So we're seeing, when you have perceptions that are that divided, that polarized about information sources, you know, they aren't trusted by a large section, a large segment of the American public.
Let me just shift the discussion now over to the question of public relations, because what you focused on are really how media is being perceived. But Tina, as we think about the situation that Jennifer described, does PR bear any responsibility in bringing us to where we are now?
Yeah, so thanks again, Jennifer, for being here. I thought your talk was fantastic and the report was amazing. So I do think that PR bears some responsibility for truth decay. I know that's shocking as a PR person to hear. But I think when you put people into buckets, that the media, and I mean the media can be all sorts of things, like Rachel Maddow, who's more of an opinionated yet covers news, or the New York Times, or the media being a biased news source. I mean, we put these groups into buckets. But I think it's the same thing with PR professionals. You have some good ones, you have some bad ones, but you also have sort of the intentionality, whether it's unintentional or intentional. And when you have and we've seen some bad examples. For instance, if you read the Truth Decay report, Jennifer gives a great example of a company that paid to falsify research that aligns with anti-climate change. And that is an example of a very intentional violation, right? And then it's promoted by a PR person and gets into the newspaper. And the newspapers have an issue because once we move into the 24-hour news cycle, like Jennifer said, there's not more facts or more stories out there. It's that you have to have more time to fill the time. So it's filled with opinion and lack of sources. But for PR as well, I think it's also a matter of being responsible and like whose truth is it? And when you're, what Jennifer also talked about, when there's misinformation or ignoring facts that are important for your audience, that's where PR does play a role. But putting PR in a bucket that we're this big responsibility, I completely disagree, because there's a lot of very important functions of public relations that is very information driven and building with internal audiences and helping with the organization, or something combating the anti-vaxxers or those who have harm for society. I mean, it really is the role also of public relations to make sure the message gets out there and that you're supporting the organization. So I see that as well. But with the truth decay and erosion of truth, we're also called to the carpet. So whenever PR or a PR professional or communicator does something that omits something to the audience or something not ethical, then it erodes the trust of an institution. So if you're falsifying your gas emissions of a car, they may buy your car, but they're not going to trust you as a source of information. And that reputation is long-term, and that trust is easily lost. So it is a responsibility of PR professionals to make sure that when whatever we say is truthful, as, I mean, every single major code like PRSA, I mean, they talk about honesty and transparency, and I am confident that 95% of PR professionals are that way. It's just the 5% that give us a bad rep.
Thank you, Tina. So, Pat, you've thought a lot about this as well. How do you think we're doing?
I have a slightly different perspective from Tina's, in the sense that, well, first of all, let me say, my perspective comes from just about 4 decades of living this, living it in Washington, being in the think tank world, being in the PR world and seeing the evolution of an approach to issue advocacy and of advocacy in general that I think has taken on a characteristic of scorched earth, no holds barred, win at all costs. And I think in many cases, there's a confirmation bias, but it's an unconscious bias in some cases. It's this, we start from the premise of we need to win. We need to win this bill, we need to win this fight, we need to win the customers over, whatever it is. And in the process, we declare all out war. And what's the first casualty of war? Truth. And I think we have to, I think we as a society, and I think Jennifer laid it out very, very well, but also we as a PR profession need to recognize that the first step in solving a problem is facing that you have that problem. And I think one of the problems we've had is, I don't think, at least in my experience, a pernicious, sinister, intentional distortion of the truth. I can honestly say in many, many difficult situations over the years, I can't think of one where a client sat around and said, we got to figure out how to put this one over on everybody. But that's not what it is. It's what it is some of what you referred to there, where I remember back when I was at this think tank in Washington, and you would see people coming out with economic data. And it was a huge difference in what that economic data said if you used this time period versus starting it 2 years later or whatever.
Wow.
And it was done to make a case more strongly. I don't think out of an intention for deceit, but somewhere along the way here, I think we lost our moral compass, we as a society. And I think we in PR have become a more important part of that society. And therefore, I do think we have a responsibility for where we've come. And we need to find a way to change that. And we can start with more diversity in our profession. Because there's so many examples of where the problem isn't so much that somebody's not willing to do the right thing, it's that they don't even see it. Sheryl Sandberg in her books talks about getting pregnant, and she was at Google, and she's trudging across this parking lot and feeling like she's going to die. And so she walked into the founder's offices and she said, I need to have a parking space close to the building. I'm 8 months pregnant. And they looked up and they said, oh, okay. We never thought about that. Well, they never thought about it because she was the only senior executive in that company that was a woman. And in our profession, I think we reflect a problem in the broader society in that we are starting from some of the wrong premises because we're not diversified enough. And I think we're also starting from the premise of how do we win this fight as opposed to what is true, what's the most transparent truth. And I think when you start, when the facts and when that truth start to matter less, that's where you start having erosion of values, of freedom, of other aspects of society.
Mark, I saw you nodding your head to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sort of, so right, I mean, I think this is what's called in my business anyway, a vertically integrated problem, where deception and lack of truth, lack of transparency has many fathers and many mothers. You can't just lay it at the feet of any one of them, but there is also a pecking order. And the last time that I have held a CCO role, I wasn't necessarily at the top of the pecking order on that. It reminds me actually of a quick story from the days preceding the outbreak of the First World War. And Austria-Hungary was pissed off at Bosnia and Serbia, and they wanted to go to war, but they wanted Germany to back them up. And so there was some manipulation going on through the Austrian ambassador to the Kaiser Wilhelm in Berlin. All of a sudden it became clear, a little too late, to the Kaiser that he had been manipulated, and he called the Austrian ambassador on the carpet, and the Austrian ambassador famously said, "My lord, I am often compromised by the fact that my emperor doesn't always tell me all the truth." Okay? And so if you think about PR people as ambassadors of sorts out in the marketplace, most of them also don't have a lot of knowledge about whatever it is they're representing. many cases, they don't have all the inner secrets. There are some PR people that have proven very adept at that, but it is the exception, not the rule. And so consequently, their unconscious bias is reinforced by ignorance in certain situations that at times can be really problematic. The other thing I just wanted to say real fast on this is that the big issue here is fundamentally around cohesion. Because I don't care whether you're talking about politics or business or whatever, right? Your success and failure individually and collectively is always a partnership with other people. And if you can't achieve consensus on a core set of facts, right, whether that's a contract or an agreement or a definition of the problem or whatever it is, then you fundamentally don't have a basis for much else. This is also exacerbated in my experience by the cycle time issue, right? The velocity with which things are happening, but also the fact that everyone is focused on very short-term outcomes. So this goes straight to what you were talking about. Gotta win now, not interested in the long-term win, right? Because maybe I won't be around to get credit for that. I want this one right here. And I'll do whatever I need to do, unless I think it's going to put me in the pokey, right, to win. And I think that is, whether you're talking about business leaders, PR people, whatever, it's a huge part of the issue.
Thanks, Mark. And let's come back to this point about the long-term versus the short-term, and also Pat's point about the scorched earth approach to advocacy. But I want to get to you, Norris. Pat told this fascinating story about people not wanting to deliberately conceal, but somehow ending up there through a process of small decisions and shading. You told a story about your experience in Maryland. I wonder if you could share that.
I'll share as much as I can remember about it. But first of all, I do want to also just commend Jennifer and RAND for an amazing report.
It was awesome.
In, many discussions over the past several months about fake news and trust the media. But this report, I think, has been a most complete, holistic capture of all of the issues that are involved and that we're facing right now. So, and the implications for our democracy, for society. So I think it's really important. And I do go between despair and hope, like a pendulum. I keep swinging back and forth because I look at where we are right now, and I know that we've been here before, but I see that we have gotten out of this. One of the things, before I get to your question, if I can, just looking historically, I see the 3 periods of time that Truth Decay pointed out, and all of those times were really significant. We were incredibly divided, fragmented, polarized, and I even go back to the turn of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 1800s, when you had journalism wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it became later, but you had newspapers or news sheets that viciously attacked Adams or viciously attacked Jefferson, and a lot of the information was very unkind, and most of it was untrue. So we've been here before, but we've always managed to get through that. Just fast forwarding a little bit to 1827, and this is an example of fragmentation, which some might have said was necessary fragmentation. In 1827, Freedom's Journal was the first black newspaper in the country, and it was created because the founders thought that the white mainstream papers weren't fully representing them, or weren't at all really, but it was an opportunity to provide news and information about a community who did not trust the papers of the time because they weren't telling the whole truth. So there was a gap there. I mentioned that to point to fragmentation, which I think is one of the big problems that we have, sort of polarization that we have today. I think it looks different. But my specific story, so I'll get to that. I worked I was a journalist for many years, and after leaving journalism, I went to work for the state of Maryland, worked for an agency. I'm not going to get too specific because I don't want to get sued, but you know, there were times when you know, I had to tell some unpleasant things about what my agency was failing to do, and there were some folks who were sort of tired of that and said, well, can't you just tell something different? Can you tell a different story? And that's the responsibility of PR, of communications professionals, is that you have to protect the reputation and integrity of your organization. And if you don't stand up and say that, no, we have to actually rely on what really happened, we need facts, we need data, and we have to tell a story that actually happened. If we don't do that, we lose. That's the erosion of truth. That's the erosion of credibility. And so I think to the extent that PR has a responsibility in our roles where we are, we have to advocate for factual information, and we have to demand that it be told in a way that that ensures that we're not transactional, but that we're building relationships.
Very much.
Jennifer, did you want to get in on that?
Well, I think it's, in terms of the role that PR plays in Truth Decay, and I am not in the PR industry, I'm also a political scientist, but it seems to me that it's not just what information is provided, but what information isn't provided and the level of transparency that exists.
Yep.
Transparency is really important because it allows the public to understand what you don't know, where the uncertainty lies, and where the gaps are in your knowledge. And that increases credibility, because if you're willing to be honest about what you don't know, that creates more trust in what you say that you do know. Going to this point about changes in economic data, it's true that small decisions about how you specify a statistical model or which data you pull from can have really significant impacts on the outcomes of those models. But in terms of how you communicate, the challenge there is how you communicate that. There's one approach, which is I'm going to make the decision that makes my data look the best. And there's another approach where you say, here's how I specified this model. Here's the decision I made about the data that I chose to use. And here's why. And here's all the other data that exists. And here's why I didn't choose that data. And that transparency, that honesty, or those robustness checks, where you show what the results are with different specifications, that allows you to build credibility, and that allows you to make a certain choice about the information you're going to use without then contributing to truth decay. And so I think that, at least from a research perspective, that's how I aim to communicate information, is in a way that is balanced, where I'm honest about the decisions I've made and why I've made them, but also provide the other information so someone who disagrees can go kind of fact check me.
Because I feel like our mainstay is that we're transparent and honest. No one will believe us if we're not transparent and honest. And I can't imagine I work with CCOs and CMOs all the time. And PepperCom, we're publishing a study next Wednesday. And we did this whole survey we didn't encounter any in the 3 studies we've done where they said, I'm not really sure what's going on in my organization. I'm just going to put out what people tell me to. Because, you have to, if you're going to be confident and you're going to know exactly what you're doing, and I feel like you have a responsibility as a PR person. If you're unsure and there's information missing, you have a responsibility not to put it out. Like if you feel like there's been obfuscation and your CEO is not honest with you, that's on you, right? You have to say, I'm not putting this information out. I'm not engaging with the audience unless I know exactly what's going on, and that's responsibility as a person. And this whole, this is the recent truth decay, this has been going on for 500 years in this US. If you've read Fantasyland by Kurt Anderson, this has been happening, this sort of distortion of reality has been happening for quite some time. And it's just, and we're gonna see it, truth decay right now, and then we'll see it increase again. It's like a wave. Right now we're in a bad time.
Just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting that you need to put out information that you think is bad information, but if you want to go back to the example that you cited from the report of manipulating data or kind of skewing the data that you present in order to make an argument, instead of doing that, it's better to be honest, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, if you're presenting scientific findings. And so I guess that's the context in which I was talking, and less in, we don't know this about our organization, and this might be false information, but I'm going to provide it anyway. So that's
Jennifer, I
Lucas-
actually agree with her 100%.
Oh,
So
okay.
yes, no, I was
Yeah.
completely agreeing with you. Yeah, yeah.
So I think it also bears saying, and I can back this up with the analytics very clearly, that this is all a relative problem. So one of the things that we see over and over again, for example, is that as a customer is seeking to make a decision, a buy decision, right? One that maybe has a lot of risk and cost attached to it. Somewhere around halfway through that process, they disengage almost completely from paid and owned channels, which are viewed as highly biased and partisan in favor of the vendor, right? And they spend almost entirely the rest of their decision-making process in independent channels, which would include press, analysts, et cetera, right? Even peer-to-peer. Why is that? Because in the back half, as they get closer and closer to that dark night of the soul, right around the decision, it's all about risk mitigation. And they see the independent stuff, right? Let's call it the stuff that is helped and enabled by PR and AR and everything else, right? As fundamentally, on balance, more credible, more believable, more honest, more transparent, more vetted, right, than the paid and owned material. That is something that crops up again and again and again in the analytics.
So independent sources are
Mhm.
more credible than
Absolutely.
institutions.
In fact, you could argue that if there's been a black eye for PR specifically, it has been the adoption of content marketing as a major part of the profession today, because it has diluted and compromised both quantitatively and qualitatively the rest of the channels. That's also clearly in the analytics.
Well, that's a provocative thought, and I want to ask Pat and Tina about that. But Jim, you wanted to get in?
Well, yeah, there's been discussion about whether a sort of renewed emphasis on ethics and getting people to be more transparent and ethical in conveying the truth is the way to solve the problem. And it reminds me of Madison's comment about if men were angels, then we wouldn't have a problem. And ethics can take us a good way, I'm sure, but I think that if in the truth business, there ought to be a market correction here, right? I mean, there should be if you are making your living telling falsehoods, the competition of ideas ought to bring that out and make you pay a price. There seems to be some kind of market failure here. And I think that may be another way of looking at what's gone wrong. And I think that goes to my point about sort of an orthodoxy being in place.
Pat?
Well, I think I believe that there's been a tremendous amount of effort, especially in recent years, by a whole range of organizations that represent the public relations business and by public relations professionals to be that advocate of transparency and authenticity. The Page Society had a terrific report about 10 years ago called The Authentic Enterprise, in which they made a couple of very important and salient points to this discussion, which is, number one, they made the point that most companies are not actually in control of their message anymore. It's affected by a whole range of their stakeholders, including their own employees and customers and others, who are all walking around with cameras and video monitors that are instant truth detectors. And so we have this explosion of instant and very rapid communications that in one sense becomes this great big lie detector, but on the other sense, has the ability, if used improperly, to manipulate facts and manipulate stakeholders. And I think the good news is I certainly have seen no evidence, and I'm involved in many companies and many organizations. I've seen no evidence of anyone trying to increase the ability to do that manipulation. But I do think there's still not quite a consensus on exactly what the agreed standards are. How do we train people the right way to do that? How do we, should we have some form of credentials in the PR business like other professions do, in which you have standards and you get licensed, and if you violate that, you get you lose your license. And that's been, something that's been debated quite a bit. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but I think that there are questions that get raised in the intensity of this. And I agree with you, Tina, the problem's been around forever, but I do believe that the intensity and urgency and strength of it in the past 30 or so years, especially because of digital and social capability, has magnified. One of the things I'm actually on a leave from Burson to teach at the University of Florida. And one of the things I teach is crisis communications, and we talk about what's the difference between a routine issue and a crisis. Well, it's a crisis, mostly you look at the combination of urgency and severity of the problem. And I would just say urgency and speed of everything that's happening right now has made this more of a pronounced problem. That I'm not saying I'm blaming the PR. Certainly, I wouldn't be in this profession if I were blaming us. I think we've been part of an overall system that's contributed to that. And I think right now the big opportunity we have, that I assume we'll move this conversation to, is
Yes.
what can we do to really drive the successful ability to address that. And I do think that that's where PR people especially are very well positioned to do.
So that's a great segue, and then we'd like to open it up for questions to folks. So Tina, Pat was saying that we may need more robust standards for truth. That
A 12-step program.
a 12-step program. What do you think?
The first is admitting you have a problem.
And the second is defining what that is. And I think part of it is that we need to do what a lot of great companies have been doing in recent years, which is facing the decision to do things, even if the right thing, even if it costs us money.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think we all have many examples of that. There's Johnson & Johnson with their Credo, and the famous example of Jim Burke, their CEO, when he was doing the Tylenol recall, basically making the point they were making certain decisions because under their Credo, that was the right thing to do, even if it cost them more money. I've been sitting once with Harold Burson. I've seen a number of examples of this, but I was sitting with him one time, and a CEO returned his call actually, and he got on the phone and he basically said to the CEO, I see this new initiative, this new marketing campaign that you're initiating, and I'm calling you because I think it actually contradicts your brand positioning. And I think it would be a big mistake to undertake this after all the things you've done to build that brand. And the interesting thing was, Burson was working with this company. Presumably, we could make a lot more money pushing that program. But he'd been involved with that company and that CEO for a long time. And he felt it was his responsibility to say, you need to think twice about this before you jump into that program.
A great example of the kind of leadership also, I think, that Norris showed with his Maryland story. So before we jump to questions, just from Mark, Tina, Norris, others, maybe one thing that we could do to help continue to advance truth in our...
Well, I think the thing that I would say, there's two things that I would say. One is that, and Wells Fargo, that situation is a classic example of this, and there are many, many others where the marketing and PR leadership did not understand the business, the arcaneness of the business. They did not understand the business detail. They, in many cases, couldn't even read a balance sheet, income statement, anything like that, right? So they were totally at the mercy of whatever information they were given. That's point one. That's got to be fixed. This industry and the marketing space, and for that matter, a lot of other functions, have to be business people who happen to specialize in whatever, right? That's number one. Number two is that in times of crisis in particular, but it's also more pervasive in the course of business, you get into an argument over the right thing to do between the comms leader, for example, and the corporate counsel. The corporate counsel is seen as having more credibility and more understanding of the business, and also they are dealing with hard, cold threats in the immediate term, right? They can go to the CEO and say, if you do this, you will get crucified, you will get sued, you will get taken to court. The PR guys basically say, well, this is the right thing to do, right? And we realize you're going to have to kind of pass through this painful period of truth telling, and we realize that may have other consequences, but that's not really our deal, that's your deal. But when we come out at the other end, right, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months from now, it's all going to be a lot better. That doesn't cut any ice for a lot of CEOs and CFOs who are under extreme stress. So the bottom line here is that even though the truth is always the right thing to do, it's always the right thing to say, if you can't also show how you're going to make telling the truth pay dividends for a business or for a stakeholder or for an organization, you're going to have a problem. That is the reality.
No,
Yeah, just to the point of corporate counsel and getting into the back and forth with your lawyers. One of the titles that I think the communications director, the PR director wears is the chief reputation officer. So with that title, I think you bear a lot of, you carry a lot of weight. You have a lot of responsibility, you have a lot of weight to ensure that whatever you do will keep the reputation of your organization strong. So, there is the whole court of, the court of public opinion thing. It really matters. If you don't want to go the way of Wells Fargo or don't want to go the way of some of your other organizations that didn't listen or didn't clue their communications people in to what you were doing, if they're not part of the decision making, if they're not at the table, you're going to suffer. It's a risky business to not include and not make sure that your PR people know what's happening. And it's incumbent upon the PR professional to be there, to insist on being at the table and to act like a reporter, to question everything that your company is doing, because you have to know you're protecting the organization and you want the organization to have credibility.
so there's an equal stature. We need to make a case for having that equal stature to the law. And, Tina, thought on that?
Yeah,
And then
sure.
I'll
I
go
think
to
there's
Jim.
a few things, like society level. The Commission on PR Education is requiring ethics as a course. I think that's critical, and critical that they recognize it at this time. Also, supporting media literacy programs are, I think, really important, and companies can do that because that benefits companies as well as having people educated about the media. Also, being responsible for the communication and listening. I mean, listening and making sure. I think Pat pointed out the diversity. It's also diversity of thought, and if you have people on your team or in your group who disagree with you, whether it's and have different people of socioeconomic status and people from different political spectrums. But that's really important because that way you can listen to people and really listen to people, not talk at them, but really listen and understand where they're coming from. You don't have to agree, but that's pretty critical. And I think most of all what PR people can do is always think about the person at the end of a message. And whether that's your employees or whether that's society or whether that's your customers, if you're always thinking about the other and the impact on the other and their well-being and their health and like emotional health, I mean, it's a win-win for both the company and for the individuals themselves.
Great. Jim, could you very briefly just talk a little bit about what PR might do to help create a new civics, which you call for in your book?
Right. Well, I think there has to be for this to be polarization and the dysfunctional byproducts, including truth decay. If that's to be rectified, I think people have to be encouraged to be civil and discuss politics and differences across the aisle. And, sometimes think people discussing differences wind up shouting at each other, but more often they don't discuss politics. It's just people are in silos, and I think that's because we haven't learned to accept conflict and actually welcome it and deal with it and as mature citizens.
So it's really interesting. Now we'd love to hear your questions for the panel. Yes, please.
So I think when we're thinking about making a business case for using facts. There's not only the kind of medium term, like if we lose credibility with our customers, that may hurt us in the long run, even if telling the truth today is painful. And then there's the really long term. If our society is, if democracy is based on facts, if it's based on our ability to have these discussions, to participate in our democracy, to care and to become informed citizens, and that erodes, it takes with it like the free market economic principles on which our economy is based. And so that world may look very different, not only for voters and the electorate, but also for companies. And so in that long-term perspective, using facts and data is clearly in everybody's interests if we want to avoid that future world that we don't even know what it looks like, but it may be drastically different for companies and corporations.
Is this a problem of externalities in a way that this kind of accumulation of untruths hurts everybody, but is seen as the responsibility of perhaps no one?
Yeah, I mean, institutions are really important. They often get a bad rap because people think of them as like, you know, the institution, the bureaucracy. But institutions and norms and the way our society functions, it's very interconnected. The economy, our democratic institutions, our freedoms, all those things are connected. But no one person maybe has a stake. Maybe if I tell a lie tomorrow, it doesn't really matter. But right, that snowballs and that escalates into something that then ends up pulling down the whole system.
I'm Tony Cheevers from ResearchGate. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. So I wanted to just ask Jennifer a question based off something Pat said about unconscious bias. I'm reading a lot about unconscious behaviors and childhood memories that you don't bring to mind, and family and culture. And I wonder if that helps inform a truth like vaccines are dangerous that is very hard to dissuade people from.
Yeah. So biases are everybody is affected by bias, and those biases are not just your party identity or things that you heard yesterday, but also just the way you grew up, the towns that you lived in, what your parents believed, your experiences throughout your whole life. And so one of the things this project has really opened my eyes to was kind of the biases that I had, and forced me to kind of challenge myself to not always look to the same sources for news information, to think about looking to other sources to try to understand different perspectives, and to challenge my own beliefs. You know, is that a bias or is that really based on fact? Maybe I should go back and check and kind of fact check myself. And so I think that those unconscious people aren't aware of the extent to which their decisions and their attitudes and their beliefs are formed over time and are really ingrained in a way that they don't even see them anymore.
May I add to that? Because, well, if you go to Harvard, if you Google Harvard unconscious bias test, you can test your own biases. You can test your biases based on race, based on gender, based on age, and it will be revealing. It was revealing for me. But I think that may be part of the conversation moving forward is, you know, can we as a nation come to terms with our own biases? Mm-hmm. Can we recognize those things so that we at least understand ourselves before we can understand how we interpret information as we process it?
Yeah, people always ask at the end of presentations, so what can I do? And so one of the things everyone can do tomorrow or tonight is to check their biases, to be honest with themselves about the biases they hold.
That almost requires talking to people who don't share your views, because people can be easy on themselves and not recognize their own biases. And that's something we don't do. I mean, people talk about, you know, conservatives watching Fox News, liberals watching MSNBC, but it goes well beyond that. There's a lot of research. Diana Mutz at the University of Pennsylvania and others doing network analysis of individuals find, you know, people talk about politics with people who share their views. They don't talk across. And so they have this impression that their views are much more dominant than they really are. And they aren't challenged. And they don't like to be challenged. So Americans have to stop being so lazy about politics and other things and be willing to engage in some conflict. I mean,
the old saying, the old definition of compromise, right, is to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time and still function, right?
And Pat, you described lack of diversity as the original sin of public relations.
Yes, and I think you know, we as a profession are continuing to address this. We haven't solved it yet. We are I think, increasingly recognizing that the issue exists and and we need to do things about it. We still have to reach some consensus on what those things are and what the metrics of success are. And I would put, so when I'm thinking of this, Jennifer, I'm thinking more like what can we, the PR profession and the PR business, do about this? And I think part of it is to develop some consensus, not so much agreement on issues, but some agreement on how we train public relations professionals to gauge those biases, what to do when they see them, or deal with them, because everybody's got them, as you say. I mean, we do some of this in management training with Myers-Briggs tests and such, but I don't know that just sort of, I think every one of the PR organizations has a great code of ethics, and all the companies do, but I can tell you, when you get into the crunch, people make mistakes. And it's not because they're sinister, they just make the wrong interpretation of how they should apply that. And I think we should, as part of recognizing that we have the problem, we should be finding some shared approach on how to train our people at every level on how to make these judgments and these assessments, and then what to do about it when they do.
I know more agencies where we're doing a study on women in leadership and public relations, and we ask questions about unconscious bias and microaggressions. And there's a lot of agencies who are actually offering having people come in to teach people about making themselves aware, and here's what to look for. So there is some professional development going on, but it definitely could be more.
Can I just tell one quick story? We did some diversity training a few years ago, and so I was putting my whole U.S. management team through it. And towards the end of the training, one of the exercises was we had posters around the room with verbatim statements from focus groups on things that various constituency groups considered offensive comments. So there was a poster on African American employees' reactions to certain comments, or the comments rather, and African, Asian American, Latino, 2 on women, by the way. There were so many. And then the exercise was the trainer gave us each 3 red dots and 3 yellow dots, and the idea was if someone said this to you, put a red dot there, and if you heard someone say it, put a yellow dot. So there's a lot of buzz in the room. Everyone's going and putting dots on the posters. And the trainer came over because I was standing in the middle of the room kind of with a far off gaze, and she said, "You look troubled." And I said, "If I'm being honest, I can't deploy a single sticker on these posters because nobody has ever said these things to me." And I went ahead and put a couple of yellow things because I've heard that they're said to people. I didn't doubt they were true, but when we came back together, she said, "I want to just recount something, because this Caucasian senior management person here is kind of recognizing that nobody ever says these things to him. But he has no doubt that they get said every single day in the workplace." And I think the more we can keep increasing people's consciousness that the need for this recognition of what truth is and what it represents, to somebody's point, well, what the beneficial effects of that are for a company. And there's so many examples. We should be doing more to train people on those examples. And I think that would be my #1 wish for this profession as we try to deal with not so much what our responsibility is for it, but what we should be doing now to help our companies and our clients and our other constituencies address this problem of truth decay.
You know, another part that occurs to me here is that if you look at the report, and it's awesome, I mean, really, truly, you should be so proud. One of the things that occurred to me is that most of what you were talking about is rooted in people's fear, right? People divide because they're afraid. They don't divide when they're confident, right? They divide when they're afraid. And they start figuring out ways to reinforce those beliefs when they're afraid. They hang out with people like themselves. They engage in all these behaviors that are fundamentally rooted in fear. And it gets even worse in extremists. So what you were talking about, when people get under the gun and they're afraid of something, they're afraid of maybe the SEC coming after them or whatever, and they realize that if they shade the truth, right, or they do something, right, they can maybe avoid it. And this is, I think we have to really kind of work on what people are afraid of.
Norris, you
I
wanted to
just
get
wanted
in?
to quickly get to the other point that was being made about diversity, because I couldn't agree more, except that I always feel obligated to say that whenever we talk about diversity, we also need to ensure that we talk about inclusion, because it's not enough to have diverse voices, but also to include those voices at the table.
So
and
true.
I think you can't really get to truth unless you have all voices at the table. You know, one thing that I think I want to say before we leave here is that I feel more optimistic in some ways than I might have felt, or the pendulum still swings. But right now, I'm thinking about the fact that we know more than we've ever known. We have more collective knowledge about our world, our universe, than we've ever known. And of course, there's this fuzziness. There's the we get the blur between truth and opinion, between fact and opinion that the report states so eloquently, but we do have something to work with. Now, it's going to be a challenge, and I think it has to do with literacy, with media literacy and information literacy, and systems that can put in place some checks to ensure that we get to the point where we improve the level of validity of the information that we're getting. But there are reasons for optimism.
Let's go, thank you. Let's go to, no, Jim, you want to get in, but let's get another question. Alan?
Can you tell me if who the backers of the study are at RAND, and if any of them are in the public relations industry?
Yeah, so this study was internally funded through our RAND Ventures program, which means it comes from gifts from donors, not specific donors, just donations to RAND, as well as income from operations. So all of the Truth Decay work thus far has been internally funded by RAND.
But not influenced by the public relations industry or members thereof?
Absolutely not.
Okay. I have not read the full report. I think I have a gist for it, and the sense that I have in this discussion is that we're tiptoeing, we're being awfully polite to ourselves about. I really appreciate that we're pressing, for the first time that I've heard of, our culpability, our responsibility here. Certainly no one wants to lie. Certainly everyone should be telling the truth. Certainly that's what we're teaching in ethics. But I think that what you might want to overlay into this study is just the sheer growth of the industry, which probably exceeds any economic index. I think there are about 250,000 self-described PR practitioners. I think there are about 50,000 journalists. I think that PRSA only represents 20,000 of the PR people. You get the idea, and we're teaching ethics. It's sort of like we're teaching scripture, but we're not teaching sex education. We're not teaching the students what is really going down and what is really the source of an ethical conflict. So systematically, what I think we're getting is a system, is an influence industry that is incrementally eroding, almost like a natural resource, kind of strip mining the fourth estate. I think that what we have is very much what we deserve. That's my comment, but I'll see if I can form that back as a question.
So the report doesn't deal specifically with PR. The report does deal extensively with the role that the media plays in this phenomenon. And I don't think that we were tiptoeing around the ways in which certain media outlets do contribute to this problem intentionally. You are correct that the number of media outlets has really increased. And as I mentioned when I was giving my presentation, that has significant implications. The competition that increases, that causes, creates a profit pressure for all media companies that drives decisions they make. It forces them to shift away from more costly investigative journalism, and they have incentives to provide provocative stories that will attract attention, attract subscribers and eyeballs to their television show or their publication. And so all of these phenomena are really serious contributors to this. And there are actors who are acting intentionally, and I think we're clear about that in the report. And there are actors who are contributing to this on the margins in an unintentional way. And I think it's important to recognize that there are both intentional and unintentional aspects to this problem. If it was only unintentional, I don't think we'd be as concerned about it as we are today. So I think that the fact that there are intentional actors is very important. But I think that, we have, we RAND are nonpartisan. We are not affiliated with any media organizations or any PR organizations. So we didn't go into this tiptoeing really around anything. We went in to discuss the phenomenon. We weren't interested in necessarily attributing or partitioning blame, but we were interested in laying out clearly the actors and the trends and the other dynamics that were contributing to this problem.
And I would just note, I mean, it's a really interesting question. One of the points you make is that social media is a real double-edged sword. On the one hand, it democratizes information; everybody has a voice. On the other hand, it levelizes the formally validating role of media. Everything kind of looks alike in a Facebook feed, and so well, I'm reminded of Pogo in part. I've met the problem, and it is us. Well, that may be part of it as well. I wonder, did anyone else want to respond to Alan's point about the kind of growing influence industry?
Well, I have a question. Is anyone familiar with Wendell Potter?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh.
Oh, maybe I better not go into it. I don't want to offend anyone, but I just saw him a couple weeks ago at another conference. It was about communicating science. Wendell worked for Humana, worked for Cigna. He was the vice president of corporate communications. He left in 2007, I think. Because he thought that he was being told to go out. And what he did is that he was writing white papers, press releases about things that just weren't accurate, that just weren't true. So now he has started a nonprofit journalism, I think it's a nonprofit journalism organization. So to give the insider's perspective of what's really going on in the health insurance business. And he's saying he's doing that to right the wrongs that he did when he worked in the insurance business. So, so there are, there was a recognition that he recognized that he, for many years, was not really being truthful, and that he needed to remedy that by now going back and addressing what he did and coming back and trying to compensate for what he thought were his wrongs back then.
Well, I would, if I could, I would just quibble with one thing Alan said, which was strip mining journalism. And I think there's just a question of cause and effect there. I think journalism has just been changing in a way, and the access to information has been changing in a way that I think it created more of an open field for the transmission of information and exchange of information. So I don't think there's any strip mining of journalism by PR. I think what there is a stepping into a vacuum created by some of the deterioration in the roles and how they've carried out those roles by news organizations. And I think the importance of that difference is just it's not to get into the question of whether one thing is good or bad. It's to get to the point that I do think that's part of the opportunity and responsibility that PR professionals have. There are many more sources of information. We are helping or originating many of those, and I think we should be thinking of them in the way we traditionally think of the way journalists applied standards. And I'm not sure we have fully developed all those standards, but I'd love to see us do more of that in the next few years. I don't think content marketing is the problem so much as an opportunity, because there's a need for that content. The question is, are you doing that responsibly, accurately, truthfully, and that's where I think we should be making clear shared standards and ethics around that.
I think that, let me just say something about that, because the analytics are really clear on this. And I do think that it is less about maybe strip mining, is more about the law of unintended consequences writ large here over a period of time. But as mainstream media started to collapse and falter financially, right? 10, 12, 15 years ago was when it really started happening in a big way. They were under pressure for revenue. They needed to fill that. At the same time, agencies in particular said, oh my God, I don't have nearly as many Wall Street journals and all that kind of stuff to pitch as I used to. So my media relations revenues are going to go down as a result. So I have to also backfill that. And every company is a media company movement. The marketing, content marketing movement, all that kind of stuff started then. Did it start with the best of intentions, no harm, no foul, all that kind of stuff? Yeah, probably did, right? But the analytics today are so solid on this, I can't even tell you, right? There's too much, right? So your odds of seeing anything that someone wants you to see is very, very limited. And then because it's all increasingly blurred, and you got to that in your study, which I thought was right on, it's blurred, so people no longer know how much weight they can put down on independent journalism, because it might not be so independent, right? It may be content marketing. And that is one of the really huge issues of our time, because the whole thing is, when I first started in PR, there were the occasional infomercial, right, and that kind of thing. And what in a print context, what happened? They printed top and bottom, this is a paid advertisement, right? Even if they made it look like it was part of the New York Times, right, they would still clearly identify it, this is paid. They don't do that anymore in many cases. Even the Wall Street Journal and outlets like that have succumbed to sponsored content. This is a huge problem. I mean, and again, this is where I can speak very authoritatively based on the numbers. The analytics are super clear.
And would Pat's idea of kind of developing more robust standards for truth be one way to ameliorate this?
Yeah.
I know we got a wonderful, tempting food platter laid out. Yes, a question.
Yes. Okay, so this was commented on our live stream, and it is from Katrina Welchie of the University of Alabama's UAPR-SSA chapter. And she says, since you guys talked earlier about generations needing to engage more into ethics, to be more discerning of fake news, she asked, do you see the current education system adding to how the decay has become so prevalent in today's society? And if so, what are some of the ways the education system can improve the way students listen to the news?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So, I alluded in the presentation to the role the education plays in causing this problem, not necessarily through a fault of their own, but rather through this gap that emerges between the changes that have occurred in the information system and the ability of schools to provide the skills that students need to navigate that more challenging information structure. And so I think there are a number of things that schools could do. One is just to get a better understanding of what are the ways that they can teach students these skills. So a lot of the media literacy programs that are being advanced now are taught as standalone modules or standalone courses, but it's unclear whether that is really having the effect that we want, because then it seems like an extra thing, something else, and schools already have so much to do. But there's lots of things that schools could do to integrate skills that students need to navigate the information system, to be informed citizens and consumers of news, that can be integrated into courses that already exist. So make sure that statistics is included in math education and teach students how to read polls as part of that. Make sure that in science classes, students are getting a good fact-based education on principles that are policy relevant. Science is often a key part of policy discussions, and so making sure that students have both the understanding of how scientific knowledge evolves and changes, an understanding of the scientific method, and then an understanding of the facts to understand those debates. reading comprehension. Reading comprehension and understanding how to read the news are very similar, but only if they're taught that way, so the students see that these are skills that they can take from reading a book to apply to a newspaper. And civics and social studies education can be included in history and all sorts of other subjects. So these things can be interwoven through courses that are already taught in a way that wouldn't increase the costs or demands on schools. And so I think that one approach is to provide standalone courses that teach students how to source information, how to evaluate digital sources, and how to form opinions and evaluate and criticize or critically analyze information. And another is to think about ways that these skills that research students need can be interwoven into courses that already exist.
And Tina, did you want to get into that?
Yeah, I would. So I'm obviously very pro PR, but I was an educator. I was a tenured professor before this gig, and I was also the faculty advisor for PRSSA for the National Faculty Advisor. So I've been teaching in colleges since like 1999. And there are standards, and it's not, and Jennifer's right, there needs to be that. And I know in comms and PR programs, they probably get a heavier dose than the other majors. And I know there's some recent graduates, I feel like, not too recent, but some people are but they've been out. And so like research methods is required for a PRSSA chapter. So if you have a PRSSA chapter, it means that you have to teach research methods, qualitative, quantitative, that talks about like currency of sources and all these things with evaluating sources. But most comms program and journalism programs, like you have to take either like a media crit class, or you have to take some sort of intro to comms or mass media effects. So we do see that a lot in comms and PR programs and journalism as well, that there is much better education today than there was 20 plus years ago when I was in college.
So maybe that's, this has been, I think, a challenging topic, but I will say that I, for one, am feeling optimistic that we are looking at this problem in so many ways. And I just wanted to, before we break, quickly summarize some of the themes that I think we've heard today. We've heard talk about values, that it's when we are in the business of persuasion, it's not about scorched earth. It's about a conversation that is founded on a vision of the value of the long-term building of trust. We've heard a lot of talk about diversity, visible and invisible, as being a fundamental way of ensuring that we are thinking about truth, about many sides of an issue, and not, as you said, Jim, being locked in and overestimating our own opinions. So values, I think, a big theme today. I would say another big theme today, leadership. And Pat, you eloquently said that we need to be advocates not just for a position, but for the truth. Mark, you talked about earning credibility to spur words in action. And Norris, you told a story about this. And Pat, you talked about Harold Burson kind of really pushing back on a major client. This kind of leadership for truth, I think, was a major theme. Strategies, we talked a little bit less about that, but Jennifer is really urging us to think carefully about separating fact from opinion, marking. Pat spoke about standards. We heard a lot about listening. This is a theme that James McNamara has announced. One thing we didn't hit on, it's in Truth Decay, communicating truth effectively with data, real solid data, with clarity about methods, with stories, and telling more than one side. There's wonderful work underway by Skip Lupia at Northwestern on this topic, and the results are kind of startling. Michigan, I'm sorry, yeah. Right state, wrong. Druckmann is at Northwestern. And last we heard at the system level, more courses in ethics. Tina, we just heard you say that there's a lot more attention today on methods, on research, on ethics. And the Institute for Public Relations, like the Planck Center, is undertaking research in this issue on this question. So really a lot of activity that, for one, makes me hopeful that we can be a positive force. And I just wanted to end on this figure here. This is from the Palace of the Marquis of Fronteira in Benfica, Portugal, outside of Lisbon. This is a 17th century palace. And what you see here is the beautiful figure of rhetoric. And rhetorica. Rhetoric in classical theory was about persuasion. But if you go back to Aristotle's rhetoric, what Aristotle said was that persuasion was really a means to identify and elucidate the truth. So rhetoric, which in a sense is what a lot of PR is, persuasion is really an approach to the truth. And so I think what we've heard today is some thinking about ways in which we can continue to advance progress. And maybe Aristotle, of course, lived before social media, Jennifer, but he did say that things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. So in that hope, let us adjourn to some convivial conversation around food. And please, let's have a hand for our panel. Thank you.
All right. Likewise. Good job. Oops.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim,
Open
thank
mic.
you. Great. Really,